I don't know whether I'll use the board, but we'll use it probably, because this is going to get a bit thick as we go along. In the 11th of his theses on Feuerbach, Marx famously announced that, quote, "the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." That is perhaps straightforward enough. But one way of framing the larger project Alain Badiou has inaugurated over the past several decades, and that's who we're talking about, is to recognize him as effectively suggesting that Marx has here given us a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy that only shows its falsity in light of a complete revitalization and de-epistemologization of the concept of truth. So return to truth, return to philosophy. If Badiou has almost single-handedly restored faith in the concept of truth, he has done so by calling for an unapologetic return to, of all things, philosophy. Indeed, for Badiou, there's little difference between what he calls the return of philosophy itself and what he also calls the return of truth. Or again, what has widely been regarded as Badiou's return to Plato. It is generally recognized that Plato was committed to truths in the strongest sense, what he quite famously called the ideas or the forms. That much is clear, however. Badiou adds that Plato's commitment to truths gave philosophy a very particular shape. Plato delineates, according to Badiou, 4 distinct kinds of truth, namely political, as in the Republic, amorous, as in the Symposium, scientific, as in the Meno, and artistic, as also most famously in the Republic. Philosophy, as Plato inaugurated it, therefore took the shape of thinking of the compossibility of these several kinds of truths, of inscribing their complex entanglements. Philosophy for Badiou's Plato is thus a question of taking the several independent kinds of truth as so many conditions for philosophical thought. As I will outline later, Badiou understands truths always to be unfolding, always to be in process. The result is that philosophy, for Badiou, has the task not of thinking about how politics, love, science, and art are all compossible in some eternal sense, but of thinking the compossibility or the being together of the several truth procedures at some given point in time. Philosophy thus, in Badiou's words, quote, "sets out to think its time by putting the state of procedures conditioning it into a common place. Its operations, whatever they may be, always aim to configurate within a unique exercise of thought the epical disposition of the Matthean, poem, political invention, and love." Philosophy is something like the constant inscription of the status of truth as the several independent truth procedures unfold on their own terms. A perfect illustration of the distance philosophy takes from the truth procedures themselves is Plato's Republic. Not only is it clear that Plato there takes as his task the thinking of the compossibility of 2 distinct truth procedures, namely politics and art, it is crucial also to note that Plato has Socrates explicitly point out that it doesn't matter whether their theoretically constructed republic could actually be instantiated in any actual political regime. The political serves, in the Republic, only as one of several conditions for the philosophical thinking of the nature of the soul. Philosophy has its own projects, apart from the several independent truths to be pursued in their own right. But if philosophy has its own projects, what is its project today? Right now, when Badiou is calling for a return to it. He's quite clear on this point. The question that philosophy has to address remains the still unsatisfactorily answered question originally raised by René Descartes. What is the human subject? From at least the 1970s, and in obvious continuity with the work of Jacques Lacan, Badiou has consistently taken as his task the work of sorting out a contemporary model of a subject without object, of a subject to truth. Badiou's revitalization of philosophy is therefore as much a return to Descartes as it is a return to Plato, but this double return is without a hint of nostalgia. He is interested in Plato's definition of philosophy and in Descartes' focus on the subject, but he embraces without reserve the obvious advances philosophy has made beyond both Plato and Descartes, and this calls for some detailed explanation. Truth and the subject. After Descartes, truth quickly became trapped within an epistemological tradition focused on the theory of knowledge. One that defined knowledge, following an attenuated reading of Plato's Theaetetus, as justified true belief. If truths are invariant, unchanging, even eternal, as Plato made clear that they must be for philosophers, it seems that, given the problem of knowledge that Plato had already laid out in both the Meno and the Phaedo, that truths must be self-evident in one regard or another. Invariance implies self-evidence. Thus, during what is usually labeled the modern period of philosophy, 2 distinct models of truth's self-evidence emerged. On the continent, European continent, self-evidence was rooted in innate ideas, invariance being discoverable simply because they are to be found within one's soul or mind. Across the English Channel, on the other hand, self-evidence was, given the Lockean assertion that the human mind is a tabula rasa, a blank slate. Self-evidence was rooted in the unproblematically discoverable facts to be read off from the scientifically scrutinized world. These two epistemological traditions, the former labeled rationalist and the latter empiricist, paved the way to the complicated Copernican revolution of Immanuel Kant. In the pathway opened by Kant and doggedly pursued by Hegel, the epistemological model of truth came under consistent critique. Indeed, in many ways, the history of philosophy at this point, in the 19th and 20th centuries, is primarily the story of an increasingly systematic dismantling of the epistemological model of truth, to which dismantling Marx himself provided one of the most crucial terms, namely ideology. By the time postmodernism came fully into its own by the 1970s and 1980s, and perhaps more particularly in the 1990s, the very claim that a truth could be self-evident came to be recognized as the clearest sign of ideology. Importantly, along with the rejection of self-evidence in favor of truth's constructedness, postmodernism in its most consistent formulations has called for a rejection of invariance, of the eternal nature of truths, if you will, outlining a basic philosophical relativism. Tracing another trajectory from the Kantian Hegelian break with the epistemological tradition, the phenomenological tradition has attempted a revitalization of the Cartesian project by, eventually, uncoupling self-evidence and invariance. Invariance no longer implies self-evidence. Willing to grant postmodernism its rigor in arguing against the invariance of truths, and thus happy to embrace truth as fluid or mobile, phenomenology has disentangled self-evidence from invariance in order to couple self-evidence with a kind of relativism. In its fidelity to, and remarkably close readings of, Descartes, the clearest examples of which are found in the work of Edmund Husserl and Jean-Luc Marion, phenomenology has thus made it clear that invariance need not imply self-evidence, and that relativism need not imply constructiveness. Just an aside here, the complex position of psychoanalysis in all of this deserves at least a passing word. Derrida spent much of his career trying to outline the essential equivalence between Heidegger and Freud, and Simon Critchley has built a career out of his arguments that Levinas and Lacan are working out the same basic project. There is, it seems to me, something very right about Derrida's and Critchley's arguments. There's also something very wrong about them. But I don't want to pursue that point in any detail here. It's just worth mentioning in passing. Badiou, though, it seems to me, has worked out the importance of the complex history of truth that I've outlined far too briefly here. Banking on phenomenology's uncoupling of invariance and self-evidence, Badiou suggests, through a kind of inversion of the phenomenological model, that the invariance of truths need not imply any kind of self-evidence. Truths, in other words, might at once be invariant and constructed. So let me make sure this is really clear. Under the epistemological model, you've got invariance, and it implies self-evidence. Truths are invariant, unchanging, eternal, if you will, and that implies that they are somehow self-evident, whether that's through a rationalist or empiricist model. This is the epistemological tradition. Postmodernism critiques this, but keeps this implication that invariance implies self-evidence, though they critique it and hence say truths are actually constructed and relative. Phenomenology comes along and uncouples these, says, no, this no longer holds, right? There's a split between invariance and self-evidence. But what they opt for is actually the self-evidence of truths, which they then couple with a kind of relativism. What I see Badiou doing is taking over that break from phenomenology, but rather than coupling self-evidence with relativism, he couples invariance instead with constructiveness. Truths are constructed and yet invariant. Hopefully we're all on the same page then. Badiou here is working with the effectively postmodern hypothesis that there is no one, with a big capital O. That being as such is ultimately inconsistent. That what is pure multiplicity. This Badiou calls uncompromised atheism. To say that nothing plugs up being is to say that what is did not originate from some absolute creator, some being beyond being. And for the benefit of those here who may have religious commitments, it remains to be seen whether Badiou's atheism cannot be accommodated within particular theological traditions. And that's a question I myself attempt to address in other settings. But just an aside for those committed to religion in one shape or another.